But it's great to be here with everybody. So look, just for the next 20 minutes or so, I'm hoping to give you an overview of the work that was really done with by 18 delegates in our 2 days of roundtable discussions on economic and financial crime. And I would just say from the outset that we had a very, very rich 2 days of discussion, covered a lot of ground. And of course, this was really, really helped by the instigating presentations that were given by the 6 speakers, 3 on the first day and 3 on the second day. I'm going to spend quite a sort of compact amount of time talking about what each of the speakers kind of addressed and really get into the meat of the discussion a bit, because it was really there that we ended up exploring a number of different issues, which I think people will find it will resonate with much of the discussion that's already happened today in the conference. And I think there were some interesting new issues that were also raised in those 2 round tables as well. So just taking day 1, where we were really starting to look at the problem of understanding that whole area of economic and financial crime. The presentations were kicked off by Mike Levy. Mike spoke on reflections informed by an extensive kind of research effort by him into economic and financial crime over the years. And he looked at the need for more nuanced understanding and kind of skepticism in that whole area. I think there's a feeling quite often that all of the problems are well understood and are in hand. And actually, I have to say, it was a hallmark of the 2 days that we were prepared to kind of tip all of that kind of received wisdom over and really go and investigate things in an open and transparent way, rather than just kind of glossing over various issues. So Mike looked at the main topics of whether we should include financial crime in the definition of SOX and the role of money laundering. And then Andrew Preston then followed up and spoke on work underway in HMG to develop new thinking on anti-corruption and the whole area of illicit finance. And the main topics he was looking at were around how a clearer definition of corruption is vital. I mean, we've been talking about definitions and this sort of stuff this morning. And he also highlighted how, from his perspective, he was really keen to interact with research and how a great push for a global effort is needed, looking at the whole issue of anti-corruption, perhaps across organizations like the G20. We then had Michelle Riccardi, who spoke on understanding the role of economic and financial crime in the serious and organized crime business. And a couple of key points here were that we need to better understand how economic and financial crime, or the economic and financial crime threats, the offenders, the offences. We don't have a very clear picture of that, is what emerged from this talk. And that, in fact, if we don't understand that, we're not very well placed to sort of think about the countermeasures, because we're missing a very important part of understanding how to then go and build those countermeasures. And the second point here was the need to better understand the relationship between economic and financial crime and SOC, and the role played by EFC in the SOC supply chain. So where does it actually fit in, and how does it drive the whole serious organised crime kind of endeavour? I think I'll move on from there into the discussion, because this really then keyed up a lot of interesting chat in the first day. I've just looked in the chat now, and I've seen someone saying that data is probably going to be a common theme. So guess what? I'm going to start off with data. So data challenges kind of came out as a massive theme on the first day. And I think really we had maybe 4 themes: data challenges, the nature of money laundering, the role of juries, and then the problem with resourcing and getting resources to tackle the problem. These were the 4 big themes on the first day. So just looking at data challenges, we had a big discussion around the various sort of issues to do with data, and I'll rattle through a few of the highlights then. It appears that relevant data for solving these issues and solving these sort of crimes, the relevant data is often very siloed, making it hard to develop large data sets that are needed for significant determination. So by pooling all of this information together, we get a much better situational awareness, but we don't seem to be able to do that. Certainly, it seemed from the group that data siloing is something which is a common feature in this space. Furthermore, the machinery of policy making and response seems as fragmented as that in many cases, making it actually easier for criminality to thrive, as responsibility in policy making goes from one group and one entity to another. And of course, from the criminal's perspective, that's fantastic, because actually they can actually work between those different organizations, the work in the cracks where in fact the different organizations don't actually cover. And then we talked a little bit about the lack of standardized definitions around the different types of crime. I guess you could think about this as data labeling, the levels of severity of those crimes. And it became clear that without these kind of data definitions, if you like, it was very difficult to start making good comparative analysis, which was a key feature that we felt was needed right across the problem space. When we looked at measurements, impact measurements, or trying to actually create measurements around the extent of the problem, it then started to emerge that we think that measurements are often very, very simplistic. And for example, when we're looking at how we might be measuring how well we're doing against something like the EFC space, we're quite often focused on volume instead of actually looking at harm and actually trying to solve issues around harm. We're just sort of counting the number of cases or the number of incidents that we've managed to solve. And then, of course, that leads into a very, very difficult question, which is then how do you start quantifying and measuring harm? And we spent a long time discussing that, but it's obviously challenging, but it's a challenge that we thought is worth grappling and grasping. There was then also a discussion around the risk of criminals being able to move faster than the current process of data collection, analysis, and implementation of policy will allow. So we're taking a long time to go from data, gathering insights, and then doing something about it. And given the nature, the sort of digital technology proliferated nature of EFCs, it's just too slow. So by the time something's coming out in policy and there's a solution, the whole game has moved on to something else. And so you're forever playing catch up. And we made the comment that this was likely to be during this session. We said that this is a likely problem that is going to manifest itself with the current situation in Afghanistan, where we can see the situation, the perfect situations for all sorts of EFCs effectively being executed with a latency in response. We then moved on a little bit to talk about the nature of money laundering itself. It turns out we identified this as a node for other SOCs. And the idea here was that it's a key node. And if we focus on this, it may well have a domino effect on making other crimes, having a significant impact on many other crimes that we've talked about within this conference and in other areas too. Money laundering is a source of indirect harm due to its nature as a node. And this idea of it being an indirect harm was also something that was picked up on. And it seemed that this kind of relationship of money laundering to these other crimes is something that we should highlight more. It's quite often hidden from the public. It's quite often hidden from the government view. It's not something that sticks out. As somebody said, it doesn't bang, bleed, or shout. And therefore, it's like the forgotten issue, but it's driving nearly everything that we're concerned about. And then this moved on to a discussion about the fact that those responsible for countering money laundering can find the private sector difficult to work with, and we think we talked about that a little bit in the previous session. And there are gatekeepers in the way. People there and organizations there wanting to protect data, their clients, their interests. And this is a kind of issue that we see in large organizations. Sometimes in the public eye, you see big fines being exacted, but how big are those fines? And are they really making an impact on the problem, was something that we talked about a little bit more. And this moved us also then onto a topic around us feeling there needs to be more done to understand the link between organized cyber fraud and machine laundering, because that's a huge area in which money laundering is growing inside that cyber domain. On the jury point, we flicked into a different discussion about whether or not the current sort of jury system makes it more difficult to prosecute financial crime. This is related a little bit to the obfuscation of money laundering, etc., inside the whole EFC space. And it was clear that a lot of work has been done in the past to sort of look at this. And there are some deficiencies there, it seemed, from the discussion around the table. That maybe the jury system or the way that juries are set up or their understanding of this space does make it difficult to successfully prosecute these kind of crimes. And so this idea of better communication and edification of juries seemed to be something that we thought would be a very good thing to pursue. And it feeds a little bit into what we discussed on the second day around the 4 Ps, which I'll come to in a minute. The last point then for the day was around prioritizing resources. So we realize stuff needs to be done. We can generate a lot of research and evidence to help authorities kind of figure out where the problems are. But there is a need for research to help to generate empirical evidence to help authorities prioritize resources and prioritize the problem space. There's also a feeling that the push for analysis and data aligned to this discussion around definitions that we've had earlier on this morning. That's great, and we need to do that, but we don't need to skew all our efforts just into that, because that's going to take us away from the action piece. And we don't need more distractions from the action piece. And there's a feeling that this might be the new domain within which we now kind of end up doing a lot of navel gazing rather than getting on and solving the problems, some of which are very obvious. And someone made the comment that just because we can't measure something doesn't mean it doesn't exist and isn't causing harm, which is another issue where we identified several problems which would be extremely difficult today to have any metrics on whatsoever. And if you take that measurement approach solely as being the thing that motivates action, and you recognize that some things can't be measured, what is likely to be happening is that there's inaction, therefore, because we just say it's too difficult to measure, so we will do nothing about it. And so this was a big risk of sort of obsessing too much about measurements and metrics and definitions. So we move on to the second day around undermining the whole problem space. Mike Levy kicked us off, and he spoke on this sort of his reflections on the 4 Ps in encountering economic and financial crime. And I'm sure everyone understands pursue, prevent, protect, and prepare, but I'll sound them out for everyone, for people who may not. This developed into a discussion around the main points that we've outlined already, and really about how relevant, whether or not that's a good structure, that 4P structure has actually helped or hindered progress in the EFCs. Karin van Wingerden then spoke to us on what works in public-private partnerships in the fight against EFCs, and gave us evidence actually from the Netherlands, which has put about 100 million euros into combating serious organised crimes, into a big push and a big effort there to really try and do something about the problem. And so we got a very nice report on exactly what's been achieved there, and also maybe some of the lessons learned from that activity as well. Helena Wood then spoke to us about the UK's crime enforcement response. The UK's enforcement landscape for economic crime, it appears, has failed to evolve to meet the threat and remains under-resourced and fragmented, was the key theme here. And it's, again, picking up from stuff that we talked about on the first day. And there was a discussion about how it isn't a problem, how it isn't a problem of there not being strict enough laws, because we've got very, very good laws and regulations and all that sort of stuff. But the big problem is around enforcement. So again, this is another interesting mirage that we might be sort of living in, is that we end up with these great policies and laws and frameworks, but actually going ahead and then doing something about them and enforcing and actually following up on those things is perhaps an area which isn't as great as it should be. So key points in the discussion that then emerged. We had a lot more key areas, actually. Problems with messaging, rethinking the 4 Ps. The problem of enforcement was a key area that we then discussed. The influence of technology, skills in technology was another area. And then we also discussed a little bit around a unified approach to kind of to data and leaked data and information, which became, it's very, very relevant because, of course, just a short time after we had the conference, we had the Pandora leaks. So I think a lot of what we talked about was very, very timely. In fact, I wondered if somehow we had something to do with it, but I mean, that's a separate thing altogether. Anyway, so some of the key points. Problems with messaging. A communications plan needs to be developed and deployed to accompany the 4 Ps, especially if the latter is rethought. So if we are going to start tumbling this around, we need to really think carefully and communicate what's changing and what's going to replace the 4Ps kind of structure. Although I think generally we agree that it needs revision and is not well matched to the problem space. There was a discussion around how behavioral science can produce tools to test the effectiveness and influence of messaging to connect to that. And we saw that social media and the whole sort of digital landscape is causing another problem in communications and messaging, and that is around the fact that there's a blurring between witnesses, victims, and perpetrators, making it very difficult to separate those kind of entities and then actually sort of understand what is going on. Under the rethinking 4Ps kind of discussion, there was a key point here around the implementation of the 4Ps needing more focus, with potential victims needing to be identified and supported in a better way. And also, I think we talked here a little bit around the siloing between the 4Ps. I mean, for those of you who don't know, I had a previous background in government, and there can be the temptation when you organize things like that into sort of 4 categories, that everyone just kicks the can between the 4Ps, and someone tells you it's a protect issue, someone else tells you it's a pursue issue, and it never actually ends up getting anybody's focus and attention. So policy and tactics need to adapt to new emerging crimes, especially concerning cyber, which I think kind of just run roughshod over that sort of structure. And then we sort of went into this problem of enforcement and really discussed this at some length, that the UK is a world-leading centre, that one of the statements was made, or discussion points we made, we talked around, was actually that the UK, we have to recognise as being one of the world-leading centres for money laundering due to its property and financial services infrastructure. And again, this was a very interesting conversation to have just days after everything we've seen in the press. I mean, this was a quoted line here. And we say that the UK, we talked about the fact that the UK has some of the best financial laws, but it has a hard time enforcing them, and that the private sector is leading the policy instead of the other way around. And so there was a comment here that the tail is wagging the dog at the moment, and we really must do something around that. And again, it links to a discussion we just had a few hours ago. So the public sector needs greater ability to perform oversight of the private, but the private needs more power to perform enforcement. And this oversight role may also improve communication between banks, which will improve intelligence. And there was a feeling that if we solve that kind of problem, then it would have a sort of, again, a positive domino effect. But there's a recognition that there's, in many spaces here and amongst many stakeholders, culture change is needed. Some of that may be enabled through regulation. And it was noted that this has worked well in certain large institutions due to large fines, but smaller organizations have been less affected by those kind of fines. And if we think about a space with emerging small companies and small organizations potentially wielding a lot of power and influence, then in fact those kind of big fines for big organizations may not be the only game in town when it comes to us thinking about how to drive culture change. Just conscious of time. I mean, I think there was sorry, Craig.
I was going to say that's quite useful I was going to fire some questions at you as well, if we could use some of that time for that.
Absolutely. I'll just finish on the influence of technology, which was a domain where we sort of talked about this having an enormous change effect on everything to do with the FCs. And we also really talked about the fact here that we're not entirely sure that government regulation, law enforcement is as well equipped in terms of technical literacy to understand what's going on around it. And this is a massive problem, right? Okay, because if we can't understand that technology space and the crime domain is shifting primarily into that area, then we are probably just looking at the wrong things most of the time. And I think this was the main thrust of that conversation. So we need more expertise in tech, forensic accounting, this sort of stuff. Anyway, Craig, I think I'll leave it there. As I said, we covered an exhaustive space. Yeah, maybe some questions.